Welcome to the Contagious Code Podcast, where we dive deep into code, learn practical skills, celebrate the beauty of engineering, and eliminate imposter syndrome. I'm Tejas Kumar, and I've been building on the web for over 20 years at places like Vercel, Spotify, Zeta, and more. Today, as we continue with Founder and CEO series on the Contagious Code Podcast, we are joined by my friend Chris Coyier, who is the founder of CodePen and CSS-Tricks, as well as the CEO of CodePen. For those of you who aren't familiar with CSS-Tricks, it was a wildly popular publication on the internet, sharing CSS tricks, among other things. And we talk about that. We talk about CSS-Tricks, where it was, how it went, how it was run, and where it is today. We also go deep. We go very, 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 very deep on CodePen. We talk about the architecture of CodePen from what it was and what it is becoming as part of a big overhaul of CodePen as it moves towards 2.0. It's a different and improved architecture, making the best use of GraphQL and React, and we go really deep on how it's being built. This discussion was insightful, and if you've ever used CodePen and CSS-Tricks, and if you're eager for not just what's next for CodePen, but also how it's being built and deep dives in and around that, this will be interesting for you. CodePen is becoming more popular. I also have had the privilege of working with the alpha of 2.0, and it's really cool. I can't wait to have you all try it at some point and share your thoughts. Now, I'd like to offer this to everybody at no cost, and this is very much separate from my day job. And how we can do that is with sponsors. The Contagious Code Podcast is sponsored by Codecrafters. If you want to learn how to code in a way that is fluent to you, sort of taking the reins from my most popular talk ever, Deconstructing React, where I teach people React by building a site with React, but then not importing React. And so we get an error, cannot read property create element from undefined. And then we just define it. We create an object with a property create element, and we slowly build React by following the error trail. Well, Codecrafters teaches you in a similar way. You can re-implement things like Git and Docker and Redis in a programming language just by building these things yourself. And by building them, you learn their mechanism, but you also level up your coding. If you'd like to take advantage of that, Codecrafters offers listeners of the Contagious Code Podcast up to 40% off their paid programs in addition to their free tier. So the link for that is tej.as/codecrafters, and there's links in the show notes. The Contagious Code Podcast is also on an ongoing basis giving away tickets to That Conference. That conference happens twice a year in Wisconsin and Texas. If you'd like a free ticket, share this on social media and mention it, and you'll enter a raffle to win a free ticket to the next available That Conference that is after the 2nd of June 2024. Okay. Finally, Contagious Code Podcast is partners with Stately.ai. Stately is a great way to model application logic and the way it flows through your application using finite state machines, diagrams. Once you're happy with how your state is modeled, including its transitions, you can then export this to a JSON document and you have code. All you need to do is fill in the business logic and you can fly. If you'd like to give that a try, go to Stately.ai. Now for my discussion with the great Chris Coyier. Chris Coyier, thanks so much for coming on the Contagious Code Podcast. I'm so excited to talk to you today.
Contagious Code. I love it. Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.
I'm so, before we started recording, I mentioned to you how much I look up to you and your work and so on. And I'm sure there's a number of folks who share the same sentiments. So for those who maybe haven't heard of you, could you do a bit of an introduction? And ideally, the introduction then gives us some jump off points that we can go and talk about things you're up to today.
Oh, heck yeah. Yeah, a lot of people know me through, 2 big projects, 3 big projects, perhaps. One is CSS-Tricks. That's kind of the oldest one. That was good 15 years I worked on that site. The site with the cheesy name, that was in the beginning kind of me sharing little bits about CSS, and then I wrote a lot, but then a lot more other people got involved. It became a small staff of people that had lots of guest writers, so it kind of became this community site with lots of writings on it that were not all about CSS. I mean, I was always interested in covering CSS, but the topic started broadening out to all things web development to the point where I don't even remember the number. It's some 10,000 some blog posts on it or something. But then that doesn't include all the videos that were published on it. There was forums on it for a long time, which dwarfed it all because, you know, the nature of forums is just a lot of posts and activity. And then there were an almanac that had there was a newsletter we sent every week, which are blog post like. And so the point is that you know, and then there was social media and YouTube, and you know how a publication kind of grows this ball around itself of all this stuff. So it ended up being like, you know, at some point you found it at some point and read it in some way, or at least landed on it when you had questions. Sometimes that was pretty common, is that some people read it like a newspaper. Some people just remember it because it would show up in Google search results. SEO was good to me for whatever reason, probably just not playing games for so long and just publishing original content. That's a good trick to SEO. So there was that, but it wasn't too long after the start of it that I started doing my own podcast with Dave Rupert. We still do it to this day. It's called Shop Talk Show. So that's another project. So, you know, podcast junkies or whatever, you know, perhaps know me from that or listen to that through knowing me or Dave in some other way. And then just a little bit later, this CodePen, and CodePen's my biggest project, has the most staff. The biggest kind of impact I've made is through CodePen, and lots of stuff going on there. So I don't know how much to get into all that, but I still, CSS-Tricks sold, as you know, so that might be part of this, to DigitalOcean a couple of years ago. I think it's almost exactly a couple of years ago, weirdly, as we're recording this. And but the other two projects are still alive and kicking, which is more than enough to keep me busy. That's me.
Thank you for that. So these days you spend most of your time working on CodePen, is that right? As the
just an unbelievable amount of time, yes. To the point where I'm surprised that I was able to ever do anything else, you know. It's like, geez.
Yeah, I read that in your blog post. So you released in February, you released this blog post about where I'm at on all this CSS Tricks stuff. And I read that blog post, and that's when I reached out to you to come on the podcast and talk about all of this in more detail. I'm curious. You mentioned in the post that you were, and I quote, way too busy trying to run CSS Tricks and co-run CodePen, and it was hard on you. I can imagine the load that comes with that. I wonder if you could speak to the workload and the what it takes basically to run both or one, starting with whichever one you want, CSS Tricks or CodePen.
Sure. Yeah. So, you know, for quite a while now, it's just two of us co-founders at CodePen. So I run it with Alex Vasquez, and he's like an amazing CTO co-founder who's just, you know, I couldn't respect more as a business operator and technologist, you know. But in a way, I'm super busy at CodePen, but I think he feels the burden even harder than I do, because like the buck stops with him for so much of the technology behind CodePen. And I felt that at CSS-Tricks, and that as like kind of the sole owner of that, the buck stopped with me at all things CSS-Tricks. So things can go wrong sometimes at sites like that. So there is some kind of inherent stress for being like, the only person that can fix this is me, or if somebody else can fix it, that's great. But ultimately it's my responsibility. There's some kind of weight to that. Was less of a big deal at CSS-Tricks. It really was just a WordPress blog. So you're like, how much can really go wrong here? But you'd be surprised. You know, there's all kinds of stuff that can go wrong, especially as the site evolves and changes, which it constantly was doing. And then the bigger thing is the business model of, it's like a little bit of the business model of CodePen, and pretty much the whole business model of CSS-Tricks was advertising, which is not a set it and forget it thing. I think it can be. You know, Google AdSense would love you to believe that you just set it up on your website and wait for checks to arrive and stuff. But the real day-to-day work of advertising is much more complicated than that, especially because it wasn't just this programmatic display advertising. Eventually it became, for example, sponsored posts at some point became like a hot item in the world of trying to make money off your blog, which meant that I don't know, some company, Sentry or something, would be like, hey, can we we release some product, or evolution of our product. Can you write about it on this site? And it's like X bucks that you make to do that, which means somebody's got to write it, somebody's got to edit it, it's got to get approval, it's got to run at a certain day, at a certain time. If there's, the links in it need to be correct. Anything goes wrong with that, you're doing makeups, it's adjusting things. It ended up just being, it's just work. It's just some version of work. And that's just one aspect of the site. There's also like, what are we going to editorially, where are we headed, and who's, manning the inbox of incoming submissions, and I don't know, like, where would we like to go with the site as a whole, not just editorially, but design wise, and, blah, blah, blah. So that was work. And I really enjoyed it, because that's, I wouldn't probably have been doing it otherwise. That job wasn't handed to me. I invented that job in a way.
Yeah.
But it was a lot. And, it felt like not tapped out, but like, a lot of entrepreneurial types, I think of that there's really no sky, no limit to what you can do with success in technology. Like, eventually you turn into Elon Musk or something if you're smart enough and work hard enough or something. Which is, I don't know, maybe there's some element of truth to that, but like, for a web publication about web technology, I wouldn't call it tapped, but it was pretty close, probably. Like, that just is what it is going to be. When we worked really hard just to kind of keep it where it was, which is doing great. But you can look at the like chart of growth. If you're making like revenue, the success metric, it wasn't like doubling year over year. That's just not going to happen for a publication like that. Whereas for a startup, it's almost expected that you double or triple every year or something. So it kind of just was what it was. And that just means that there's going to be a lot of work, and it just is going to do what it's going to do. And I was fine with that. We ran it like that for a long time. But when the opportunity came, and the opportunity being DigitalOcean knocking, being like, hey, we have kind of a perfect opportunity for you, I really was all ears. Especially because I just didn't really see it coming, in that like blog acquisitions aren't super common, I'd say, or at least they didn't feel like it to me. So yeah, I think that's what you were asking, like, why was it so much work? And it was because it was all that work, but then I always felt more, CodePen requires more. There's employees, full-time employees, which we didn't really do at CSS-Tricks.
How many full-time employees did it have at its peak?
At its peak was like 10 or 11. Now we're 7. Not because we're doing any worse than we were, but just through natural ebb and flow of people coming and going, and what we need at the time. I'm talking about, we're focused
sorry to interrupt, I'm talking about CSS-Tricks, not CodePen.
Oh, sure. That is, it was Jeff as the editor, and it was, I'd call it a part-time gig, but he worked on it every day. So he was kind of the biggest employee. And then Robin wrote the newsletter. We had at some time, it's hard to explain. It basically, for people that were considered full-time, it's like 0, because I wasn't even really full-time.
Yeah.
So, as far as people even putting in 20 hours a week, it was 0 probably.
Right. Yeah. I think you demystify a lot of interesting things for the listeners, which is, for one, ad sense and ad revenue. I know there's a lot of folks listening to this thinking ad revenue is just set it and forget it. So I appreciate that you highlight the various like checks and balances that you need to manually check and balance. That speaks to the revenue model. About CodePen, it's great. I love CodePen. It's got tons and tons of whimsy from every time I use it. The buttons animate and it does all these cool things. I'm curious about the tech stack, because you mentioned in this blog post, CSS-Tricks is WordPressy. It's basically a WordPress site, and you have this article about all the WordPress things CSS-Tricks uses, and it uses everything. What's the stack of CodePen look like? Is CodePen open source? I don't think it is.
No, we've open sourced little pieces of things we've done over the years, but like kind of the fundamental part of it is not open source. It's always a subject of discussion, like what should we do? And we definitely have plans to open source more of it and more of the kind of interesting bits of it. It's not a small choice, and it's not a small amount of work to get there, in my opinion, for various reasons, but that's another discussion perhaps. The stack of CodePen is very kind of bespoke and just infinitely more complicated because it depends on I never know what kind of perception people have of like how complex it seems as an app, but as somebody who helps take care of the app, it's like, holy jeepers criminy, is that a lot a lot of work, especially and I haven't said this yet, and I'm not trying to like turn this into a promo session or something, but part of the reason CodePen is so much work right now is because we're working on a CodePen 2.0 release. So the whole team, most of the effort is going on to a new version of CodePen that's essentially a rewrite of everything, and it's one of those cliche things, replacing the the airplane engine while it's flying kind of thing. We have millions of users at CodePen. They can't be disappointed in what we're doing, so we're building this new version for them that's hopefully like, yeah, it's like anything you could do before, but 10 times more, in my opinion. So there's the stack that's now, and at the same time the simultaneous new stack, and it's some parts are the same and some parts are different or whatever, but I can go over the stack a little bit. It's Ruby on Rails is just in there. And that does a lot of stuff like auth and serving up some of the pages of the site and some of the functionality and stuff. That's, we're not unhappy with it or anything, but we've been slowly moving away from it a little bit. So there was a time many years ago where we're like, React is great for us. It matches our model pretty nicely. Let's start building more and more of the site in React. So we did that. And then we layered on top of it at one point a GraphQL API. This is many years back, so most of CodePen is powered by this GraphQL API wherever it is on the site. Pretty cool. We're pretty happy with that choice still, I think, at this point. And sometimes our React page would be really rudimentary. It would just be like, we're just going to hand roll it using no framework at all. It's like just, I don't know, vanilla React. Is that a thing? I don't know, but it might, like the parent page might be rendered by Ruby on Rails, but there's not much there until React takes over, meaning it's almost entirely client-side rendered. That served us for quite a while. This new stack at CodePen is like, let's lean into the Next.js thing, because Next I find it quite nice as a product. It's got all kinds of stuff up to and including the server-side rendering bits. That's pretty important to us. We never moved the editor itself, like when you land on a pen and you're seeing the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. That's, there's some bits of it that are React powered, but kind of the core of it is still a Rails page before some React stuff takes over, largely for SEO reasons that we hadn't cracked that bit back when we made those choices. And it's just too dangerous to take this huge site with, I don't know, it's probably coming up 100 million pens and just say, those are client-side rendered only. Like, I'm sure you've perhaps overheard horror stories of stuff like that. Like, no, those are going to be server-side rendered. So now in moving to Next.js, we'll still have that server-side rendering of those things and not be in a dangerous SEO situation. But that Next.js site then is consuming the GraphQL API. I'm still talking about the stack in some world. The first GraphQL API we did in Rails. There was some kind of Ruby gem thing that kind of helped you construct a GraphQL API, but have it be powered by your Ruby on Rails site. Again, no regrets, worked pretty well for us. But over time, there's some scaling issues at CodePen, not huge problems, but like scaling considerations, call them. Like if you need to make a database migration or something on our pens table, non-trivial. It's a Postgres database now, but still, like you can't just be like, let's add 5 columns and delete 3 and call it a Monday. it's not going to happen, especially if there's data processing that happens while you're doing that migration, like, change a format or something. There needs to be code that's running as you do that. Man, that was very difficult to do. And in the languages that we were most familiar with at the time, like Ruby. So at one point, and this is many years ago now, we're like, you know what, let's lean into these more modern backend languages. It was Alex, our CTO, who first was like, we should lean into Go. And so everybody has had their own little Go journey at CodePen to the now that we're pretty much all of us know Go to some degree. Our backend is now mostly Go. And we moved even the GraphQL API to that. So there's kind of two APIs internally. It's just the way things go sometimes in web development, not ideal, but when you're doing a big old transition, it's just the way it is. So now we have this really powerful and really fast GraphQL API in Go and a variety of web servers and processors and things. All of our stuff is in Go that way. So the stack is like, the ideal stack for us at the moment is a Next.js site using GraphQL. Everything else is Go on the back end. That's the perfect stack for us.
I'm curious about the choice of GraphQL. And that's just because these days on Twitter, I'm seeing a lot of thread boys go like, so somebody posted recently and they said, does anyone care about GraphQL anymore? Is GraphQL dead? Like there's all of these takes in the sort of fast food style content cycle. And I've seen people question GraphQL for 2024 sites. I don't fully understand why they question it. I use GraphQL in some cases and it serves my needs, especially when I'm using it as sort of a bridge API to like many different discrete services. I'm curious if you could speak to that.
Yeah, I feel like perhaps both of us are old enough at this point to roll your eyes at some stuff like that and be like, really? You're going to pronounce it dead? Sounds like a little clickbait to me, like especially when it's not backed up by anything really meaningful. Once in a while you might, if some big tech company, if 37 Signals decided it was bad, they could point to that and be like, see, a big company made the decision I'm talking about kind of thing. And you're like, yeah, well, whatever, that's one company. And also I feel like usually I take what they say with a grain of salt, because you're like, you have this like incredible super genius staff amongst you that's just a little different than most of us are operating with. Not that my staff is also super geniuses, but we didn't like invent Ruby on Rails and stuff. Okay. But like, I look at what we do day to day and I look at like, oh, I see the front end requests these pieces of information and I can follow the thread. All of us can follow the thread and see like, here's the resolver that GraphQL hits because it's asking for users. Oh, interesting. I can see where it gets these little pieces of information, and some of them, go to our logic section of our site and I can look at the logic that's happening there. I can see the auth that's happening, and then I go all the way back to seeing the Postgres MySQL SQL query that's happening that gets that data and returns it. And maybe it's just my familiarity with the stack, but the fact that I can like trace it all the way from the front end, all the way to where the data is coming from and how it's authed and all the way back. I'm like, it's just very satisfying to me, and it feels very empowering. And I'm like, why would I throw this away? Like, I'm not having any problems with it. Like,
exactly.
You can theoretically tell me that some other approach might be better or something, but you do
and
you.
it's proving value. It's serving its intended purpose, as far as I know, which is reducing the number of round trips, because you use your resolvers to fetch things and you get everything in one round trip, at least from the client device. So awesome. Thank you for saying that.
Imagine a very complicated front end that has 150 components on it. That might even be light for some pages on CodePen, where we have this design system and this complicated logic that's going on. And each one of those components might have a little GraphQL file on it. And they'll ask for some data that they need. And there's a lot of repetitive stuff in there too. Like, how many of those components ask for if the user is logged in? Tons of them, 50 of them, But there's technology that smashes all that together. It doesn't mean that there's going to be 50 requests to the server to ask if somebody's logged in. Smart stuff happens during the build process that combines all those GraphQL queries into maybe not just one, which is even cooler to me. It might be like, that's too much for one. We're going to do it in 3, and you're like, well, thanks. Sounds efficient. Good on you, And then it'll do those 3 queries as quickly as it can and sprinkle out that data to the components that are asking for it. It's like, wow, nice. And that technology is Apollo, which also gets crapped on plenty because it's occasionally, I don't know, not the fastest thing in the world, but it's like you can measure that stuff. I don't disagree that sometimes people misuse things like that. But there's also this, even the people that crap on it usually say, well, websites that have really long sessions, that have really complex needs, I can back down and I can say, yeah, maybe that is the correct technology. And I'm like, well, that's what we got.
Yeah.
So thanks,
Yeah. Speaking of really complex needs, I'm curious about one specific number. You mentioned millions of pens. What is the WAU or MAU, roughly, like off the top of your head, of CodePen? And by WAU, I mean weekly active users, if you have that.
I lost you just for a minute there, but it sounded like you're talking about just like active usership of CodePen.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean,
average.
I do have that information. I don't know that I've ever shared it. Feels a little weird to just drop it on a podcast without talking to the team about it. So I might plead the fifth on that one.
Yeah, sure. Cool. And I think I have to ask another question. Now that you mentioned GraphQL, you mentioned data fetching complexity, and that CodePen is very complex. You mentioned Next.js. You're going to the Next.js route. I'm assuming this is like the latest Next.js 14.
You know what? It's not. Only because when we started, we were on 12 or something, and then what's the latest one again? 14?
14.
14. I think it requires Next 14 requires React 18. I think, and changing React versions for us. I did a PR at one point, like, let's do this, let's get up. Why wouldn't we just be on the latest, And there was like enough little weirdnesses that we ended up shelving the PR for now. And I can't remember the details why. There was some little silly ones that were easy to resolve. Like I think Next 14 has a different link element, or like you had to nest how links work in Next.
Yeah, I remember
differently.
that. Mm-hmm.
But that one was easy. But there was some other things, and I cannot remember what they are. I'm so sorry, but it was something. And it was like, this is a little bit of a distraction. We're kind of, it felt for a moment like we're upgrading for the sake of upgrading. There's nothing that's that wrong. Let's just roll with what we got for now. It doesn't mean never, but whatever. I a little bit regret it, I'll say, because Next does such a good job in their documentation and somehow their community supporting. If you look up how to do something in Next, it's going to be how Next 14 does it.
Yeah.
And it's freaking annoying to me because I'm always like, oh, no. Like, where's the little drop down that gives me these docs for 12 or 13 or whatever it is? And there isn't one.
Yeah.
So little regret, but I think we'll just get upgraded one of these days. And
And I feel like it's a stepping stone. I mean, you're moving from Ruby on Rails and like only client-side React to like this whole thing. So I can fully see how it's just a stepping stone until you're on the latest and greatest Next.js 14. Okay. I'm excited for y'all to at some point move to Next.js 13 and 14 because that will then give you support for server
components. We
components.
prove it out by shipping it. There are some pages that are shipped already on Next on CodePen, but we kind of piecemeal it. We like take some little, like I think the about page or something is on it just to make sure that we're ready to deploy it and there's no weird gotchas and stuff. That's often how we roll. So I think I know the about page is, but I think there's a variety of others. But what I remember, it was actually a really big, long project for us to get that page rendering on it, believe it or not. Because what we did is not only switched the rendering to Next.js, but that, because DevOps wise, that means, sending traffic to different servers and things like that. But it also meant let's have the API use the new API as well. So all of a sudden, you're on the home page and it's getting a Ruby on Rails site hitting the Ruby on Rails APIs and a Next.js site hitting a different API, but you would never know. Like it doesn't look any different, but it was proof positive then that the componentry is shared because there's some not to drop another big dumb thing, but there's some monorepo concerns here, that the components are shared in both places into one place. It's not like we rewrote everything. So, the homepage of the site can pull in and digest the same component on the next side as the non-next side. And that the API is so consistent that it's doing the exact same thing, even though it's technically a different endpoint and a different server. It's proof that the API is consistent with each other, and that was a big job.
Yeah. I'm excited to hear about if and when you'll move to the latest Next, because then that involves server components, and I see benefits there, especially with something like CodePen, because you have more fine-grained control on what's server rendered and what's not, right? And you can use composition. You can your individual components can use this really well designed GraphQL API to get just the data that they need even. So whenever I'll be following that blog post whenever it ships.
Yeah, I admit I don't. It's not that I don't get it. I understand what a server running code and returning responses is like, but I admit that I haven't felt it yet. I haven't totally grokked what it's like in React server-side components. It seems like such a sea change in React to have this thing that was designed its entire life to just have its only concern be the browser. So all of a sudden be like, oh, I'm sorry, it's required to have a server behind it? And what kind of server? Is it just a Node server? Does it run on other JavaScript runtimes? What are the minimum requirements for it? What's that? Weird.
Yeah, no, exactly. And that's why, I love how well you capture this, because for 10 years, it was client only or client first. I guess you could do SSR. But 10 years later, you're right. It's there's a whole new paradigm. And I continue to watch the work that the team's doing, especially Dan, talking about, I don't know if you saw his blog post, it's called A Tale of Two Reacts. And it's, okay, imagine React, the blog post is literally this. It's, okay, imagine React. Imagine React doesn't exist. And now let's create React from scratch, but it's different. And gosh, it is such a sea change, as you mentioned. But in terms of what kind of server, that's, I guess, also where the ambiguity is, right? Because it could be a local dev server, could be a CI/CD server that builds like a Netlify thing, or it could, So whenever CSS-Tricks is on that path, I would love to follow that so hard. Cool. So your stack seems really approachable to most developers. You've got Next.js, you've got GraphQL, and you've got Apollo. You talked about the benefits of GraphQL, and I think we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about also the benefits of Apollo, and that specifically, by that I mean the code generation. I don't know if y'all are using CodeGen, but for me, this has been a lifesaver, because it makes sure that my reference to the returned data from a GraphQL query is actually referencing data that is returned. So it's TypeScript plus that. Are y'all using CodeGen? What's that experience like?
We do have a CLI command called CodeGen that we need to run all the time, but I don't know. Is it Apollo who gives us that? I thought it was a different tool somehow, but I could be wrong. Maybe I'm not up to date on it. For example, if we have as part of our GraphQL API, we have a folder full of .graphql files that represent the schema, essentially. What does this API have in it? And if I go in there and change that and say, I need to add something to this model or whatever, this GraphQL query that I want people to be able to do, I just do it right in the schema file. And then I have to run this CodeGen tool. And the CodeGen tool is going to go change up the resolver then too. It's going to literally take the old resolver and be like, I see you're missing the avatar piece to this, and it will just put it in there. But then it's also going to put in there it's going to throw an error if somebody asks for it. And then so you're like, okay, I see. You've made all the changes to the types and things, because it's actually quite nicely. It's all fully typed too. That now it's 50% of the way there. Thanks, you've scaffolded what you needed to scaffold for me. But now it's on me to write the code that makes sure that I actually go get that avatar from the correct place and return it, and put any of the auth in place that needs to be there too. You always got to think about who can ask for this. Is that are you authorized for that? So we use a tool, and it literally is called CodeGen. But I don't know if it's the same one you're thinking of or not.
It might be, because what I guess, and we'll find out, I guess, is it's the Apollo code gen is definitely in there somewhere. There may be more code gen steps, but every time I've used Apollo, that's where I've gotten so much value. Because, like, as you said, it just scaffolds a bunch of things and also type checks it scaffolds types. So if I remove a field from a GraphQL query, then it will, and if I'm referencing like data.something.field, it will just tell me, hey, just so you know, this field doesn't exist. Super helpful. Awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you for that.
That's clutch, isn't it? And it's not only types, it's like I don't know what, this is yet another tool. Maybe this is the one you're talking about. It's not just our schema that gets code gen. It's every single GraphQL query and every component on the entire site has a little GraphQL file, and types are auto-generated from those. Exactly like you said, if you remove a field, and now you know in your component when you're trying to like use that data for something, if it's not in the type, then it's an issue. That does presuppose TypeScript, because that it assumes TSX components, which is where hopefully this doesn't gross anybody out, but we're 50-50 on that, and it's just because at some point we decided, hey, that sounds like a really good idea, but we're not going to take months to rewrite every single component. Yeah. So our setup is such that you can write a TSX component, or our JS components work fine too. Don't get the types in but you kind of do, because VS Code just, whether it's TypeScript or not, you get some benefit of types existing even in your JavaScript.
Yeah, I think that's just so I understand correctly, all the new files you create, those are TypeScript, and it's just the old stuff that's JavaScript, or do you still actively create new JavaScript files?
This is not to cast in. Yeah, I think we have enough experience now that chances are the muscle memory is there to just do it in TypeScript. And then if you go touch a component, I just did one yesterday where I touched a component and I was like, I'm just going to switch it over to TSX quick, because there's enough going on in it. It can be a little annoying because, at least in our stack, the way it's set up right now, if a TSX component imports and uses another React component that's in JavaScript, the TypeScript is confused by it. It's like, I don't have there must be some implicit types or something that come from it. So every time you use that component in your rendering, you have to put a little tsignore over it. And in our code base, it says, well, that's because that component hasn't been converted yet. So the temptation is to be like, well, I'll go convert that one too. But that one then probably has another one that it depends on. And then you got to convert that one too. And it can be this little rabbit hole that you're like, I'm just going to leave the tsignore there for a minute.
Yeah. So, and then this is where the real religious TypeScript engineers will show up and be like, no, it should be a TS expect error. In any case,
I didn't even know that.
Yeah, it's one of those things that the Twitter boys come after you for, because TS any or what is it? TS ignore, is just don't do anything, and TS expect error is the next thing is expected to break. So it's like any, except it's more explicit that it's good. I don't know. Somebody will correct us in the comments.
Grok why it mattered so much. I mean, what I want is for the code to build, and if I don't do anything, TypeScript is so mad that it'll literally just not render. So I just need it to render. If it still leaves the red squiggles there or something, if you do the expect error, maybe I could see that being a little social motivation to finish the job at some point. But I'm like, believe me, we have the social motivation already. I don't care.
Good. Good. Can I ask a question that you're maybe not at liberty to answer? I'm just curious, and you can tell me, plead the fifth if it's not something comfortable with the team. So you mentioned you're working on this new version of CodePen for the fans, for the users who love it, which I am one of, I will admit. Are there any new features there, or is this just a feature parity, new design type thing?
I lost you for a minute, but you're asking about the 2.0 product and what it's capable of?
Yes. Well, I was asking about the 2.0 product, if there are new features planned, or if it's more of a facelift and a new design and a new stack.
Oh, it's very both. It's the stack, it's the design, and it's the functionality and features. So that's why it's, this is quite literally a multi-year project, which not everybody has the liberty to do. Fortunately, our CodePen is successful enough that we were able to kind maintain the existing product and make it better in little ways, but focus most of our effort for a very long period of time on the 2.0. But yeah, it's going to be littered with new features. Are
you at liberty to share what
yeah,
those
I
new
wonder
features
what,
are?
I mean, I could take you through an alpha test, not on this podcast probably, but I'm trying to remember like what we've already said publicly that would be fine here. There's nothing that's like, I don't think like so crazy secret that it would be like, dude, you blew our marketing or anything. Here's one of them that feels obvious to me that I know we've talked about before we kind of pause the podcast. It's just about generally like permissions on a pen. The world has moved on a little bit with like social documents, and I'm thinking of a tool like Notion, a tool like Figma, a tool like Google Docs. There's this expectation almost in digital documents that I can type in your email address and then say, you're an editor with me, and then you're an editor with me. Google Docs is probably the most famous for that. Like you need to set the level of access to something like that. That feels like it has firmed up in the expectations of online documents kind of, and we're going to offer that. So that was a little bit of a rewrite of how access to pens and things work. Pretty non-trivial, honestly. Especially because we want to offer features around that, like levels of access and, how real-time that access is and who's the owner and who's not, and administrative access and different types of protection against it if it's not public. Because remember, CodePen is kind of public first, and then you lock down the document, which is different than a Google Docs approach, which is kind of private first, and then you open up the permissions to it. So that's just a little like layer of technology over the pen. So is it a new feature? Absolutely. Is it the entire point of the 2.0 product? No. But to me, it's a big deal. Like some people consider that. I know. I wish I could remember the post, but there's a great post on Figma that like really attributes that online permissions system that they baked into it. And the fact that Figmas aren't files, I think they might have some file format now, but people generally don't do that. They don't download a Figma to their desktop and then open it later in Figma. It's just some URL.
Yeah.
Was a what do they call that? Network effects or like viral growth was attributed to that like even one designer at a company could start using Figma and they could be like, hey, go look at this design. And all they had to do is send a URL and change the permissions so people could look at it. And they'd be like, yeah, that looks great. Oh, how interesting. What is this tool? Yeah, we should have a team account on there, Or I need access to edit it too. Can I play around with that document? Oh, sure. Let me just type your little name in here. Now me and you are both working on it. That can have these network effects that we're looking for. And I think that's why the industry has settled on it, because it, from a business perspective, it kind of works. Makes a lot of sense for us to follow suit.
Right. So it's also, then it sounds like from what you've said, it's this permission thing, but it's also the multiplayer side of it, where you can collaboratively work on pens with friends. Pens with friends. What a name.
Yeah, and that's just one little piece of it. The overall goal with 2.0 is to be able to do more with the editor, because there's some pretty heavy limitations to when you need to stop using CodePen. Like what you can't do on CodePen is pretty present in people's mind. And part of that is okay, because sometimes people choose simple tools based on their simplicity. Like, I don't want it to do any more than what it does. I'm choosing it based on its simplicity. So that's a tricky, tight wire to walk. But if you're a company, having your product be more capable is pretty tempting, because you can charge money for those things. So keeping the simplicity while allowing it to do more is our goal. So CodePen would be the same, but more.
Yeah, it would be so cool if it could stay simple, but like the user could sort of like move a slider for how complex they want it to be. Because when you when you talk about that, you hit a real nerve with me, because Reddit, for example, I used to love Reddit, Chris. I used to absolutely adore Reddit. It was my favorite website. But now they, since like Reddit 2.0, it's heavy, and they've added
Mm,
megabytes and megabytes of JavaScript and CSS, and I cannot enjoy using Reddit anymore. It's just, I don't want to see skeleton UI. I want to see links. I want to see images.
yeah,
I want to get
sure.
my content. And it used to be light, but I feel like they fell into the trap of wanting their product to be more capable and made it more, quote unquote capable, which really just made it slower to me. And I agree with you 100% about CodePen. I love CodePen, and I love its simplicity. I love that I don't have to think about, okay, it's time to NPM install this thing, and oh, there's TypeScript, so now there's red squigglies. No, I want to show you how to do like a pure CSS input button with cool validation steps or something
Right.
like that.
So that's
And
our charge to be like, that should take care of that use case. If you want to do a pure CSS demo for somebody that's very simple, that we should not get in your way. You can do that all you
yes,
want. But if you're like, you know what, I actually do want TypeScript, to be able to turn that on and get the red squigglies should not be something that we're just like, nope, you can't, got to go somewhere else for that. I don't like that as a business owner. I want you to be able to opt into that experience if you want to. It probably won't be a slider, although I think that's a funny concept. And I have seen, there are examples of this in the wild. Famously, iOS has I don't know if a lot of people have seen this, but there's an accessibility feature in it. I'm sure everybody's seen people that like turn their font size up like super big on iOS, so you can look at like one text message at a time kind of thing. That's an accessibility feature. But in that same vein, there's this like mode that you can flip on iOS that just hides like 90% of the stuff on iOS. And you look at even the home screen, if you look up at the phone, there's only like 4 apps. It's like
yeah,
web, text, photos, camera. And it's like, it turns your iPhone into that. And you're like, wow, And I'm sure there's some people, and not to be too, whatever, it's kind of for old people, like I hate to be too, I'm sure other people benefit too, but that tends to be how it maps out, that love it. They're like, get out of here, all this crap. I want the simplest experience ever, and it probably works great for them. Again, not a slider, more of a toggle of like super simple mode or complex mode. We're going to try to thread that needle, believe it or not. I think we've done it.
I'm so eager to try this. And by the way, about the iPhone thing, I prefer the simple mode as well, because it's way too easy to doom scroll and get distracted and all these things. And honestly, I found out that without social media, phones are actually really fun.
Sure.
And so awesome. Can I share with you some things from CodePen that I sometimes feel the need for, but then I'm happy they're not there because it's so simple. And this is probably top of mind for most users. But I'm curious if
Sure,
it's,
let's do some
if
live.
maybe I just don't.
I'm going to
see it.
write all this down, by the way, because it's kind of my
Oh,
job.
this is perfect. So NPM install, like, so a whole module bundling system thing. And this is often the time I leave CodeBen to go to like Code Sandbox or StackBlitz or something like this, is when I want to NPM install React. And with CodePen, I would just use like CDN.js or something like that.
Right.
Which, again, I like that, because if I translate this experience to Code Sandbox, I know Evis, he's a friend, I'm not disparaging. It is slower and more complex than CodePen, because there's more logic, and then it needs to download the dependencies, and we all know how long npm install takes, and it's a lot. But when I come to CodePen, I'm not mentally prepared for a lot. When I go somewhere else, I am mentally prepared to wait. And so is that feature part of CodePen? Has it been added since I've experienced it? Is it being added in 2.0?
No.
Okay.
NPM is a beast of a thing to support, to do it in such a way. And Eves they've had pretty public trouble of bandwidth costs and things that they've talked about, and they've made some pretty drastic business changes around that. I don't know if it's all NPM related, but I wouldn't doubt that that has a big part of it. Is because when somebody has 10 dependencies and you're saying, I'm going to spin up a box in the cloud for me and straight up just run an NPM install, and that bandwidth is on them for their costs, that I have no doubt that can get extreme. It was a long time ago when people started wanting this, when people started saying, oh, I need to pull this, React carousel from NPM or something. Alex could speak to this on our team very well. He really wanted to support that. I mean, we got so excited about being like, you should be able to type ESM at the top of a file, import React from React, and our system should be able to know what you mean and make that happen for you. And we spent a long time trying to make that work, and even had kind of working internal systems for it before we were like, man, there are so many gotchas and problems. And it's like every problem in the NPM ecosystem becomes yours then. It's just a very difficult problem. So, in the end, we didn't ship it. It was right at the time when SkyPack was starting to become a thing. Fred Schott, now famously from Astro, that was his project. SkyPack was super interesting in that it would you'd get a public URL. You know how you reference CDN.js? They can kind of do this, but CDN.js started at a time when the point of it was just a link to a file that's on NPM that's already been built. But not everybody does that, and it was kind of pre-ESM. And if you want an ESM import, the NPM ecosystem really has struggled with this. Is still, what percentage of packages on NPM are ESM ready? You'd be shocked. It's so low. It's like 10% or less, I think. Like, wow, right? Even though all of us all day long write import statements in our JavaScript, that ecosystem is so big that a lot of people are writing in Node. That's a different story. It's got to support all these different ecosystems. It's wild. But SkyPack did this cool thing where they not only grab that dependency from NPM, but they would run it through Rollup or something and make it ESM ready. Even if that dependency was not ready to be imported from a browser, they would force it to be, and then they would cache it on their side and everything. But unfortunately, they did it for free, and there wasn't a super great business model behind it, and they just had to stop doing that for the most part. These days, there's even more modern, faster, better tools for it. ESBuild became a thing in the world. ESBuild can also grab an NPM dependency, smash it through ESBuild really quickly and efficiently, and make that file ESM ready. That's what this website esm.sh does. They're like SkyPack, only using more modern tool. They do it a little better. There's there's all various CDNs that are starting to do this. Because that ecosystem now existed, that was good for CodePen, because if you want to use React from CDN.js, not only them, you have all these other options. You can now, you don't have to just link it up in your HTML React. You can import it like you're used to seeing in kind of a regular React project. I think a lot of people that work in React are used to seeing import React from React at the top of their files. You famously don't have to in Next.js because they're just cool like that and just assume that that's a dependency or whatever. But a lot of React like Create React App, you would see that at the top of your JS files. So because that ecosystem exists, you can largely just do ESM imports on the CodePen even of today, and that kind of saved us from having to invent that technology ourselves and kind of offload the problem to them. We'd even, if you type, even to this day, if you type import React from React in a pen, a little yellow thing will pop up and it'll say, I bet you want to import, can we fix that for you, is basically what we say. And if you just click yes, it just changes the import to load it from esm.sh instead. That way it'll just work, and it'll probably work just how you think it's going to work, which is very satisfying. Unfortunately, that's good. Pretty much I'm not that worried about it. It has solved the NPM use case for client-side work. Now, without revealing too much, the CodePen 2.0 product, we want you to be able to do more, right? So I want lots more abilities of CodePen. And even something like TypeScript, this comes up. We support TypeScript on CodePen now, kind of poorly, but if you write an import statement at the top of a TypeScript file that says import, I don't know, UUID from the UUID library, TypeScript's going to be like, that better, where that TSC processor runs, UUID better have been NPM installed or Yarn installed or PNPM installed already. It needs to be available to TypeScript, because TypeScript's going to want the types and stuff for it. It's just kind of implied. So if you try to process TypeScript somewhere where it's not available, TypeScript's going to say, oh, bro, error, broke, busted. You need to install that. I don't know what to do with this import statement. Well, that's a problem for us because our TypeScript processor can't have every single thing on NPM installed already. Nor do we want to necessarily run an NPM install every time you run every single time a pen is run, because we're going to have the same kind of bandwidth cost problems and slowness problems and, so it's not that there's not a solution to this. It's just that the solution is hard and complicated, and it needs a good user experience tacked on top of it. We have it. I mean, the guy sitting 5 feet from right now has a really cool idea that he's working on solving it for CodePen. We're going to have solutions for it, but of all the things that CodePen 2.0 is already doing really nicely, that is still a very tricky one, and it's very likely that we launch without having like perfect, amazing NPM support for everything. If you just load it from esm.sh, you can still do a lot, but that doesn't necessarily solve the problem if then all of a sudden you flip on a server-side processing tool like TypeScript. That's a harder nut to crack.
When I import an an ES module from esm.sh in CodePen, is it what I'm imagining is I would import React from, and in this case the string literal is not React. It's not the package name, but it's like a full HTTP URL to esm.sh/.
That's
okay,
right.
Cool. And that just works. That's so cool.
It does in the browser because that's valid JavaScript.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? But it doesn't necessarily if you run it through a code processing tool on the back end. That's a little bit
but CodePen doesn't have support for that anyway, right? Like it doesn't have an integrated terminal where I can run like a server.
No,
if you talk about the TypeScript server, you mean, okay. So the TypeScript process, that's something that y'all run for the user.
Right. Well, so today on CodePen, you can turn on TypeScript, and it really does run your TypeScript. But what it doesn't do, and this is embarrassing, but we added this TypeScript support like a long time ago when we didn't even really fully understand TypeScript probably. It doesn't even do red squiggles or anything on type problems. It just transpiles it to JavaScript for you, which is to this day, that's what ESBuild does. You know, like if you want all the squiggles and the type checking and stuff, you're running the TSC compiler, like the one from Microsoft that does all that stuff. The one like tools like Vite that are like, we process your TypeScript automatically. They just do nothing. Like all they do is they strip the types and they just get it to JavaScript as fast as they possibly can. That's great because that's really useful in a build tool. But for the UX of it all, you got to go through the much slower TSC compiler to do that. And so because we never did red squiggles or anything, in our TypeScript today, you can do that. You can put the whole URL, the esm.sh in there. It's going to error in your TypeScript, but TypeScript has always had this really generous thing. Like they'll error, but they'll still produce the JavaScript file for you. So you're just unaware of it as a user that has errored on you, but it still produced the JavaScript. So screw it. You know, the TypeScript compiler of CodePen 2.0, we want to bring you that red squiggle experience. So trickier to deal with there. And it's not just TypeScript. It's any single thing that processes JavaScript on the back end. It's Next.js, it's Vite, it's anything. So you need to like solve that NPM problem at a level that works for all of them. Tricky.
I guess that is very tricky, especially because it seems like it becomes very expensive. Like I know StackBlitz has this thing called Web Container, which is basically that they over HTTP will expose a runtime, and you can run Node.js stuff in there.
Oh, it's so cool! It's so cool.
Yeah,
they took a different path like that, but that happens, that dev container on your machine. So when you NPM install something, it's your bandwidth that's asking for that stuff from NPM. That's cool. That punts the problem for them. They don't have a bill for that. What they had to do was innovate this dev container thing, which is amazing tech. You know, we're kind of leaning the other direction in that we're handling most of this stuff server side for you, not as we think there's some strengths there that we can lean into. For example, you don't have to download it can be real fast. You know, you might think of the server being slower than doing something natively, but it's not always because the weight of what's happening, there's no download cost to hitting a server.
Yeah. You mentioned ESM and CommonJS discrepancies, and I feel like a ton of listeners here have been bitten by these errors that, you tried to import a CommonJS module, but it's an ESM or something or the other. I think it's worth spending a few minutes clarifying that for people listening. ESM, ECMAScript modules, basically native in the language, supported by the browser, import statements. right? Whereas CommonJS was the Node.js specific, like require statement driven
Indeed, it
module
was. Yeah.
heuristic. Okay. Why does that error happen? This may sound really basic. I apologize, but if you try to import, because especially in Node.js, I feel like because of transpilation tools like Babel, if we write an ESM style import or an import statement with a relative path, wait, sorry, I'm correcting myself here. ESM imports can only be on like absolute URLs. Is that a rule of import state of
Oh,
ESM
no,
imports?
ESM can be a fully qualified URL or a relative URL, but it can't be bare. They call it a bare modifier, I think. You know, when you see import React from React, in the quotes, React at the end, there's no slash, there's no dot slash, there's no HTTP. That's invalid in JavaScript. That's not valid JavaScript. When it gets to JavaScript, that's got to be gone. So it was kind of a useful distinction because stuff like Webpack or whatever did understand what you meant. It was like, hey, this is in your node modules folder. Go get it. That's what it was saying.
Yeah.
You know?
And what they would do, I guess what they would do is just swap out that in the quotes React for dot or dot slash node module slash React slash whatever.
And then it would get bundled and you wouldn't see it at all, you know?
Yes. And so we can get around those errors by just doing that, and like referencing instead of a package name, like a file or a file on a fully qualified URL.
Resolve that. So who and why and what and whatever. So Node can kind of do it, but yeah, you're right. Yeah, it can be done in that way. The reason that CommonJS errored in the browser is because CommonJS, the syntax of it was literally a require function. It just said the word require and then it had parentheses. And the browser sees that and they're like, what's require? I don't know what that is, you know?
But you could maybe I bet there is a polyfill for this where they make a function called require that just does an async import.
Oh, absolutely. That was what UMD was, is that it was like this format where it was like it worked however you wanted to use it. It had this weird wrapper around it all, and through some computer science magic, it was happy to work in CommonJS or ESM or AMD or whatever they all were. That sucked though. Now we have a spec. It's called ESM. Everybody likes it. It's better. It's more efficient. It's faster. It works in Node. Just, it's still controversial to this day. Surprising to me that people were like, screw it. Let's just stick with CommonJS. And you're like, no. ESM. That's how I feel.
You know what I found? The people who say let's stick with CommonJS are the same people who say GraphQL is dead.
Sure. You're mad for some weird reason or something. I could see it if you made like a Node utility. It has no utility to the browser whatsoever. It's only for Node. Only. It's a server-side concern. Then who cares? Like that, it's only designed to ever work in that one environment. I could see having no motivation to make it an ESM compatible thing. Yeah. But I don't know.
Yeah. In CodePen, in the editor, you already mentioned you run a TypeScript process. I also noticed there's a number of other processes that run. For example, this is actually something I was pleasantly surprised by. I was building something really nice in CodePen, and my CSS got very big and unwieldy. And I was like, oh gosh, I'm starting to lose track of the cascade here. And it's my fault because I didn't structure it well enough. But then I was like, wait a second, I could just write Sass here. And I'm assuming the architecture for that is very similar to the limited TypeScript transpilation step in JS. I'm curious if you could speak to that. Like, is it the same? Is it different? What does it take how do you even like take Sass and then transpile it? I'm assuming all of this happens on the browser. As far as I know, there's no round trip that sends it off to something.
It's a round trip for sure. Yeah, CodePen has always leaned into the using a server to do this work. And that's just because it's part of our strength. Like I said, we think there's some advantages there that are to me. In the olden days, we used to just spin up a Ruby server somewhere, because Sass used to be in Ruby, if you'll recall, and it would just be sitting there waiting for requests, just strings of Sass to arrive. We'd process it, we'd send you back the CSS, and then the client could use it however it needed to. Or another server is more likely to receive that request, because at some point we need to concatenate it all into a finished HTML document to serve in an iframe for you to see. So there might have been a couple of jumps there server side for it to work, but it's always been a server side thing. And then serverless became a technology that people leaned into. So you could write all these little one-off processors like TypeScript, like Sass, like Less, like Stylus, like Babel, all of them, to us became Lambda endpoints. You know, we would ship a tiny little Lambda that's its one job in the whole world was to take a string of Sass, process it, return it back, you know, and then we could architect and compose those things together to work. So yeah, that's how it worked. And we were pleased because, you know, all the dreams of serverless worked in that scenario. It was super, super cheap. It was secure because it's you know, it's not as secure as like Dino is now or something, because there's still people trying to like escape from your serverless functions so they can Bitcoin mine or whatever, but you could lock them down pretty easily. And you know, and then they escape onto your tiny little Lambda that has no capabilities, you know, because you can tell the Lambda like, you have no network access. Okay, well then somebody cracks your Lambda, it's like there's nothing for it to do. So who cares, you know? So they were cheap, they were secure, they were fast. You know, it was like, wow, the serverless dream was real for us. You know.
Yeah. Okay. That's a lot. And this is not a bad thing. It's a good thing. It's a lot simpler than I thought it was, because I thought there was some service worker magic going on, and like, whoa, there's a real time process. And cool. The only question I have about CodePen, so I feel, by the way, I there's been sort of a meta conversation happening here in my head where I'm going like, how, like if I wanted to, if it was an open source project, or if I wanted to show up and fix a bug or something, how comfortable would I be in this code base? And based on everything you've told me, it seems I would be somewhat comfortable in it. Of course, there's maybe a lot of things I don't know and so on, but like, look, Next.js, GraphQL, serverless, etc. So cool. The only thing we haven't talked about is,
guy. I think you would have no trouble at all with the how people experience it. You know, we've had a long time to get this right, but our local dev environment is all Dockerized. So the day you'd have your first laptop at CodePen, you would pull our repo, which is a big old mono repo. There's only one, you know, literally mono repo, and you'd run our bash script. And the bash script calls about 50 other bash scripts as it goes, but it will even set up your laptop for you. It will homebrew all the stuff it needs to homebrew, download the crap it needs to download. And then, you know, our Docker containers are in a Docker registry in the cloud. So you would have to install Docker Desktop, you know, and then it just spins up all the stuff it needs to start spinning up. And CodePen, like I said, is fairly complicated. So you can't just npm run dev CodePen. There's just too much stuff for that.
Yeah.
So we use this thing called Tmux, which is this multi-panel thing as a CLI tool. And what it spins up the Ruby on Rails site, and it spins up all the Next.js sites, and it spins up our TypeScript watchers, and it spins up our Go servers and endpoints and all that stuff. And they're all like individual panes in the CLI. But I would think somebody with a brand new laptop, you know, boom, and then CodePen is ready to use. CodePen.test, you know, we use locally. And then you'd be like, oh, I see, this is a Next.js site, which you've seen 100 times, and it's not that weird, really. I mean, there's a little bit of, I would say our Apollo thing is probably the thing that would take you the most time to wrap your head around, because we have to kind of do early queries to GraphQL to like prime the Apollo cache and stuff, and sometimes that's a little funky, but I would say otherwise you'd just be like, oh, I get it, you know. Oh, here's where you pull in your design library. Not weird.
This is so cool, because I'm trying to dispel the myth that highly popular, highly trafficked products like CodePen are like so complex that everyday developers can't reason about them. And what you're telling me here is most listeners of the podcast, if they were to, you know, join CodePen and get this bash script and just get the time to onboard, doesn't seem like weeks or even a day. It seems like hours, which is quite cool.
Yeah, I would say that would be true.
You mentioned a lot of things in the industry that I'm impressed by, because you're really like on the pulse of things. You talked about like what was it? Snowpack. Was it Snowpack? Skypack. You talked about Skypack. You talked about ESM.sh. You know how they do web containers. Like you run the gamut on things that are in the zeitgeist. I'm curious if you could speak a little bit to your process of staying in the loop of this. I mean, you're running CodePen, you were running CSS-Tricks and navigating all that acquisition and all of that. Gosh, there's so much going on, but you're still up to date. How?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm sure it's not terribly surprising. I ran CSS-Tricks for 5 years or 15 years. That it kind of made me this public figure in a way I kind of made it my job and responsibility to kind of know what was going on in it. And I didn't do it begrudgingly. I did it because I liked it. I probably would read tech news and try to be a part of all that, even if I just liked that. And then I don't think you can ever turn that off. The fact that I liked it, it's not like all my sources and information and incoming information stream immediately disappeared when I sold CSS-Tricks. I still have all my RSS feeds. I still follow all the same people on Twitter and now Mastodon and Threads and Blue Sky and all that stuff. And I would say RSS is still my best one. And to that, I happen to use a feed reader that I can subscribe to newsletters too. There's quite a few good, decent tech newsletters, and it's not like I stare at each word of them. But if there's any tech newsletter, I just subscribe to it. Like it doesn't increase my burden so much that I'm like, I don't know if I have time for that. If I don't have time for it, I just mark it as read. I kind of cruise through my RSS pretty quickly, and I think my headline scanning abilities are pretty decent, where I can be like, ooh, that's interesting. And then I have my own little system where I'll open up the tab and kind of look at it and see if it actually is interesting. And if it is, I have this, this is nerdy, but I have this Notion database where I use the Notion web clipper, and I put it in this database of articles that I know are interesting that need a little bit more attention from me at some point. And some people think of those tools as like, that's where articles go to die, that you'll never read it. But to me, because I still am responsible for some writing, for example, the CodePen Spark goes out every week, and I write a column in it every week. And I know that it's up to me to put something in there. And a lot of what I'll do is I'll have this database of articles, and I'll try to pick out a group of them that have some common thread. That I'll be like, maybe some interesting stuff was happening in React, and these 5 people kind of weighed in on it. Or I can just use something real generic and be like, there's these 5 SVG articles that I've saved up over the last 3 months. Just as a theme, I'll talk about SVG this week. And I think that like having some responsibility to formulate thoughts about the industry forces me to stay pretty up to date. And I think I am, although, I am occasionally very humbled. I on my own podcast, we recorded an episode with Fred from Astro the other day, and he was talking about all these data storage tools and other things that I was just like, what is that? What the heck are you talking about? libSQL. I don't even know what that is. It's some fork of SQLite or something, but some big company that's some big player in the hosted SQL serverless community. And I was like, I've never seen this in my life. So in some degrees, for like CSS stuff, feel real up to date, stuff that has anything to do with CodePen up to date. But like anybody, I got my holes in what I know.
This is cool. You've given me a couple protocols. I think it's quite cool because like I've been making notes. By the way, if you see me looking off camera, that's what I'm doing. You mentioned having a forcing function of disseminating information, of sharing stuff through the CodePen Spark, for example, and through your podcast. That has served me well as well. That's congruent with what I do because I speak at some conferences every now and then, and sometimes I'll prepare talks or I'll propose talks that I don't know the details that much about, and then they accept it, and I'm like, oh, I gotta learn this thing. And not only do I have to learn this thing, I have to learn it and be good at it enough to speak about it confidently. So yes, that has been super helpful for me. And also this one I don't do, but you said this and I was like, whoa, which is you subscribe to a bunch of newsletters and whatever. Like if you don't have time to read it, or if you feel like it's burdening you too much, you just mark them as read. That I've never heard that one, and that's something I probably will start doing because that's so cool to just have the information for when you need it. For me, I have like some type of curse where I can't, if I get an email, I have to read it in detail. I can't just like mark it as read and be like, I'm not reading this. And if it's a newsletter, even more so. For example, I get in my inbox bytes.dev. I'm not financially affiliated with them in any way. It's my favorite newsletter.
Oh, I love that one. Isn't that good? Although I do find myself,
so good.
I tend to scroll down to they have like a list of like 10, 12 bullet points. That to me is the most valuable part of that particular newsletter because they tend to find stuff that I somehow have missed otherwise. The intro is usually good too. They have like kind of like what's the hottest thing that happened this week. And I find that interesting. And then I just immediately scroll down to the bullet points and read them.
Yeah, exactly. But I'm going to try and get your gift of like being able to, if I'm under some type of load, to just not even do that. Because like I get bytes.dev and I'm like, oh, I have to read this thing all the way now. And I have to read every single one of those links at the bottom and see what's happening. So that's really cool. So I get the information and then defer it if I have to. That's really useful. We covered a lot of the stack of CodePen, but one thing we failed to talk about, which may not even exist, is you alluded to it, I think, earlier. You said design system. Does CodePen have a design system? When was that created?
Yeah, I would think our previous designer, Claire, helped a bunch with it. But I always feel weird about it because I don't know that we followed any kind of industry standard way of thinking about a design system.
It's probably too early, right?
No, I think it was probably decently well timed with the rise of design systems as a industry phenomenon. But sometimes I think of a design system, I think of one of the things you do is you get all these components together that are these base level components that your whole site can use, like a card and a button and a dialog and a drop down and these things. And then you apply design tokens to them, which is kind of like a color system. And maybe you piece some of those components together and, like you have this thing and it's sitting over here and you use those components, as prescribed or something. And I don't know that we did that. We didn't like start like that. What ended up happening is that there was just a folder called components, and it just grows up, and that's where your components are because that's what React asks of you. So in a way, I always felt weird that I was like, if you have a React site and you've broken stuff into components, that's your design system. Like you've already done it. Congratulations, especially if you use something like CSS modules and you attach the styles directly to the component, which React doesn't ask of you, but I would say most React sites use some kind of CSS and JS or Tailwind or something that like kind of scopes the styles to that particular component you've created. And then GraphQL is that way too. It says, the queries, the data that this particular component needs are tightly coupled to that component. I think that is a design system. We did grow up from there, and at one point we cut out every single component that didn't need data, essentially. Like if it doesn't have a GraphQL query, chances are it's generic, and and we call that the library. And now there's a lot of components that are in there that are probably closer to that design system approach. Like that's where the button component is. The button never needs to make a query. If it does, then you just wrap it quick in a different component that calls that library component. So that's probably the closest thing we have to that design system. And I do think of it as that. And then we do have, a layer up from that, which I think we just call components instead of library. And when something is a component, it's still shared, but for whatever reason, these are allowed to have a GraphQL query. And these are a little trickier for us because we have the two APIs. So like if it's in there, it means that it's kind of ready to be used on a page with either API. And so that has a little bit of a prerequisite, and that's just inside baseball stuff for our particular code base. But that's how that works. And it's because we have a mono repo. It's because and it's not just, we have like 3 different Next.js sites. I think one of them is an admin site, what is just for people who work at CodePen, and it's for like looking up users. There's a screen where you look up a user that has way more information on it about that user than it just doesn't need to be public. It's not interesting. It has payment history and when they signed up and if our spam catching machine caught them for some reason, why is that there? And a big old button to verify their email in case they weren't able to do that. Just very admin-like activities. But there's no reason a website like that shouldn't be built from the same crap that your website is built from. It's not for everybody because, if it's different, fine. But for us, it's like, why not? And as an opportunity cost, why not build that with the same technology you build the rest of your site with to foster mastery of the tools?
And also to eat your own dog food. So if you find an issue working on this admin thing with one of the components, then there's a high chance if you fix it there, you fix it in CodePen for all the other users, right?
Yeah, I think the advantages are a lot. It feels very good to have all of these tools be, I think you use dog fooding. Yeah, that's the term. Let's dog food it all, baby. We even proved out the Go GraphQL API. At one point we're like, let's do that. We first built a admin only GraphQL API in Go because it's a little different. We actually have a different endpoint for it. It's a different piece of technology just because you can. It's not that you're loosey-goosey with it, but you don't have to worry about auth as much. It's like you kind of just assume that any query to an admin API is locked down at the very top level. Like you can't even hit it at all if you're not an admin. That way you're not worried about auth on a really granular level. It's just kind of easier to write. So we wrote that first and we're like, yeah, this thing is smoking, like it's real fast. So that was enough proof for us to then continue on and build out the other API.
That's awesome. I've got like 3 more questions, and these are all CodePen stack. Somebody asked me about running Tailwind CSS in CodePen, and I mean same thing. You need to run a process to scaffold the Tailwind config, and then there's a build tool with Post CSS. You don't get that, but I might venture a guess as to how you can still do this. And for me, if I wanted Tailwind CSS in CodePen, I would just like add an import directive to the CSS and get the baseline Tailwind rules from some CDN, and then that's it. I have the class names available. Is that a good approach to getting Tailwind in CodePen?
I saw somebody do this the other day in a way that surprised me. I haven't used Tailwind all that much, but I know its level of popularity in the industry. They offer a CDN hosted URL. It's right to their server somewhere. I wish I could find it for you. It might have to end up in the show notes or something. But you just go script. You just go script source and something tailwind.js. And you can do it anywhere on CodePen. Put it in the HTML area, or put it in stuff for head or wherever. Link it up as a resource, and then it just makes the entirety of Tailwind available to you. You have to do nothing else. Yeah. And I was like, that's freaking great. It's not efficient at all, but most people on CodePen aren't shooting to build a finished website that goes to their clients. They're trying to prove out little ideas or figure out something or figure out a bug or learn a technology. So I think that approach to using Tailwind on CodePen is actually great. You're also right that they have this like mega build, which is of Tailwind. That's just everything Tailwind has to offer, and you can link that up in your CSS and use Tailwind that way. That's maybe even worse performance-wise because it's probably megabytes of CSS. I think this is a little bit funny to me because I've seen, a WordPress site do that too. They're like, oh yeah, we're Tailwind users. They have no build process. They just link up the entirety of a Tailwind build and use it. To people that are serious Tailwind aficionados and users, they know that that's not correct. There is a correct way to use Tailwind, which is their very exotic and frankly pretty cool build process where it's looking at your templates, it's deciding what very minimal set of what Tailwind offers is required to style your site and shipping that CSS. The reason I think that's so cool is that, I think science will tell you that is the absolute minimum amount of CSS you can ship to style that site that's going to beat any other way to write CSS for a site. It's going to be super efficient. And I think that's really cool. So you can't do that on CodePen right now. It's just not happening.
Yeah,
You know, you do it some other way.
But you shouldn't.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you shouldn't have to do that on CodePen because, as you so astutely put it, nobody's building a production website on CodePen. It's not what it's for. CodePen's not Wix or Squarespace or whatever.
Yeah.
So
it's different, but I'll tell you, you know, I do want CodePen to be able to do more, and it is our goal to use Tailwind properly on the new CodePen. Like I do want that kind of real usage of it, if nothing else, to help educate the industry that that's how you should properly use it. Because it does bug me a little bit that people use Tailwind in such in a way that instead of gaining performance, which is I think one possible compelling reason to use Tailwind, that they're losing it instead. That sucks to me. You know, like I want you to use if you're going to use it the right way. God dang it, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, that's I respect that. I respect that a lot. We've touched on so much of the stack. There's still one thing that I have a question about, which is the data layer. Not the data layer with GraphQL, but the other end of GraphQL. Like, what are the resolvers talking to? And I'm guessing that there's a ton of different like database services going on. You've probably got some type of caching layer and
a little bit.
Yeah,
there's some like basic stuff in Redis or whatever that we keep around.
Yeah.
There's a Elasticsearch in usage for search specific, because that's kind of what it's for. But the vast bulk of it is Postgres, and the APIs talk directly to that Postgres database. But you know, it's on the Rails side, you have whatever it is, active record or whatever to talk to get the data out of it that you want. There's so few of us write. It's not like there's no manual SQL queries. There's probably lots of them on CodePen, but for the most part, a developer isn't writing select star from pens where pen ID equals 1287. You know, like that's pretty raw, and not a lot of us do that these days. You use some kind of ORM to do that kind of makes it more expressive language to ask what you want. So it's active record on the Rails side, I think. You know, like again, I'm not more front end than back end, especially at CodePen. And on the Go side, it's called GORM, which is just Go plus ORM smashed together. And I like GORM. You know, what little I've written of it, it seems like that's a nice way to pluck some data out if you need. And I will shout out that Alex at one time wrote some really powerful generators that are based on the GraphQL schema. You know, I talked about you type, our little code generation tool, and it scaffolds out the resolvers and stuff. Mm-hmm. When it gets to that point where you're like, oh, I need to resolve the user avatar or whatever, it is on us. It's on some developer to write at some level. Eventually, it needs to query a database to get that URL out of it.
Yes.
But he wrote this thing that's like, it looks at the structure of the database, all the columns and all the tables, as well as the schema, and somehow there's these generated GORM functions that are that just do that job. Conceivably anything that you could ask for, it has this query syntax, this generic query syntax that's just ready for you to use to do that. So you often don't even have to write GORM stuff, because we just auto-generated just a ton of it for every single table. So it's chances are the thing that you need to ask for has already kind of just been auto-generated, and those files are just sitting in this folder, and they all end in .gen.go. So that, don't touch that file. That's been auto-generated, And if somebody goes around and writes a database migration and that table is different now, it'll just be regenerated again, and that new column will be ready to query for. And then sometimes you'll see next to that generated file an ungenerated file, and it just says the generated stuff just didn't have it for me today. There's just a little bit of extra custom database stuff that I needed to do that's just a little different that our generated thing couldn't do. So it's a special bit of GORM data asking logic there. And there's less and less of that over time. I mean, it's not uncommon to see a PR where somebody's like, oh, I see you wrote something custom here. Turns out you don't need to. You didn't know this, but our generated thing could. There's a preference to use the generated code because it's,
Right. But it's not a rule.
Right.
Yeah. Awesome. Okay, my last question. This is one that I don't know if you can answer. Admittedly, it is a bit of a dumb question, but I still want to ask it, Chris.
No?
Which is the big 2.0. I would be remiss if I didn't recognize that everyone's talking about AI, and you're talking about 2.0. Is there overlap between AI features, copilots, 2.0, generative stuff? And again, you may not be at liberty to speak here, so feel free to plead the fifth.
It hasn't been a big focus for us, to be honest, yet. Everybody's excited about it and thinks about like the interesting things we could do at some point, but we feel like we just have some more clear fish to fry with the capabilities of it that like, you know, I mean, what have we seen so far in AI and code? It's been pretty impressive, right? It's like, write this code for me, refactor this code for me, let me ask a question about this code. Those are pretty neat things, and I use all of them sometimes. And some of them you can just have anyway on CodePen. There is this a company called Codium. I think it's called just CODE, and that's IUM or something like that. That I think have done really impressive stuff. Like when I use their autocompletes, I generally prefer it to Copilot, which is the other reigning winner of it. I think they do a good job. They have a browser plugin that's literally free, and you just install it, and then you get all that AI stuff in CodePen. They like make that plugin work with CodePen, and it's awesome. So I'm like a little hesitant to like dig into doing a bunch of work where like, oh, it takes about 2 seconds for you to get AI cool features on CodePen where I did no development work. So if it's just something just like, it's not like, hey, CodePen will never offer built-in auto completions. Maybe we will. But I like waiting on it a little bit because the more time goes on, the more commoditized these things get and feel. There is so much VC and so much fast-moving action behind this stuff. I think an inevitable fallout from it is companies that are like, oh, do you need these basic AI features? We have commoditized it for you. It's just an API service like any other. You pay for it. It's not incredibly expensive, and you integrate it into your product, and now you're offering those features. Essentially, the longer you wait, the more available those tools are going to be for your company, and you don't necessarily have to be the one, you know, crafting unique models and playing all that game.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you. If a big VC came to you and said, "Hey, I want to buy CodePen," I bet that even happens. Like, what would you say to that?
Usually, you don't get the "I want to buy CodePen." That is fine. Send me as many emails you like about that as you want. You know. I'm not saying that's not an impossible outcome for CodePen, but VCs tend to invest, not buy your company. You know, companies buy companies. VCs want in when somebody else buys your company. So yeah, we get plenty of VCs these days, and I kind of laugh at it because I'm like, you know what? You're smart because this company is freaking going places, and if you got in on this, if I let you in on this, it would turn out great for you. You know, but I also laugh because if I were to take that call and sit down with them and go through everything, they would say no. They would say no because we've been around a long time and we don't have 2x, 3x growth every year. What we have is really slow, steady growth. And VCs hate that. That's absolute VC kryptonite is, you know, what do they have some disparaging term for, like a family company or something, you know, like whatever.
A lifestyle
company. Yeah, there you go. And it's like, yeah, well, screw you. Maybe we are a lifestyle company. I don't mind my lifestyle. Thank you very much. But I do have bigger ambitions than that. I do think we are, especially with what we're building, have some huge potential in this thing. And I intend to realize it.
Awesome. But, so okay. So an acquisition is not out of the question. Wow, that's
no, but they're going to have to buy us on a hell of an upswing. So good luck.
Yeah. Awesome. Chris, this has been such an incredible chat. Thank you so much for making the time, for sharing all of your insights, especially for being receptive to my feedback and ideas around CodePen, but also explaining like with such mastery the stack from Next.js to GraphQL, the front end, the back end, everything. On behalf of me and all of the listeners, thank you.
No, you're an excellent. You should be a podcast host. You're very, very good at this, and I appreciate your own mastery and being able to talk about this stuff eloquently as well. It's a real pleasure.
Thank you for joining me for my discussion with Chris Coyier. I hope you learned a ton, and I can't wait to see your reactions to CodePen 2.0 when it's out. I hope you developed an appreciation for our discussions around CodeGen and GraphQL and React and all of it. And if there's something at all that you can take away, then please do share this on social media, because if it's something you learned, there's probably someone else who could benefit from learning this as well. If you're learning from and or enjoying this content, I'd invite you, if you're watching on YouTube, to subscribe to the channel. It's a great way to support us with no effort. Also leave a thumbs up while you're at it, and maybe hit the bell. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, then if you could leave up to a 5-star review, that would be tremendous for the channel. And of course, you're probably at the podcast through social media, so if you feel compelled to share this on social media, we'd appreciate that. This has been a really fun episode of Founder CEO Season, and next up we have an even more special episode. So once again, if you're not subscribed, feel free to do so. Thank you again to all of the sponsors. Thank you for sticking around, and most importantly, thank you for your interest in software engineering.